Disclaimer. All stories presented in this video are either fictional or based on accounts submitted by viewers, authors. Any resemblance to actual events, people, or places is purely coincidental. This video is created solely for entertainment or educational purposes. The opinions expressed in this video are subjective and do not claim to represent absolute truth. Thank you for watching.
Story 1. The Room That Doesn't Exist. My name is Michael, and this happened 3 years ago when I was working at a small office in the city center. Our office was located on the 9th floor of an old building where things always seemed to break down. The elevator wasn't working, the electricity would cut out. One day after lunch, I decided to take the stairs up to my office because the elevator was once again out of order. The stairwell always seemed strange to me, dimly lit and smelling of old concrete. When I reached the 9th floor, I noticed the door to our floor was closed. Normally, it was always open. Nearby, there were other doors with no sign on them. I had never noticed them before, but I thought, maybe this is another entrance to our office. I opened the door and stepped inside. It was a small room filled with chairs, old boxes, and tables. Everything looked as though no one had been there for a long time. It smelled dusty and musty. But what surprised me the most was that on one of the tables there was a pile of papers, and among them I saw my access card, which I had lost several months ago. I was shocked. How could my card end up there? And honestly, I had the feeling that someone was watching me. I grabbed the card, left the room, and closed the door. The next day, I asked my colleagues if they knew about the room. My colleague Jason, who had worked there the longest, said that there were no other rooms on our floor, only offices. I thought it was some kind of mistake, so I decided to check again. I went back to the stairwell, reached the 9th floor, but the door was no longer there. It was just a wall. I called Jason and we searched every inch of the landing, but we didn't find anything. I still can't explain what happened. I kept the card, but every time I look at it, I get a strange feeling as though I did something I wasn't supposed to.
Story 2. The traffic jam disappearance. This happened in Los Angeles during the morning traffic on the freeway. I was driving to work as usual when I saw my friend Tom's car. He always drives his old red Ford Mustang. I decided to pull up closer and wave at him. We always joke when we meet in traffic. But when I got closer, I noticed that the person behind the wheel wasn't Tom. It was a man who looked exactly like Tom, but he was wearing a completely different shirt, and he was holding a phone that I had never seen Tom use before. I thought, maybe it's his brother or a relative. But why is he driving Tom's car? When I finally got to work, I immediately texted Tom. "Were you in traffic on the 405 freeway today?" He replied, "No, I'm working from home. The car is in the parking lot." For a while, I thought maybe it was just a car that looked similar, but the license plates were definitely his. Even the sticker on the back window was the same one I had given him. The next day, I asked Tom if his car was definitely in the parking lot. He said he hadn't even left yesterday. It was his Mustang. And at the same time, it wasn't. I still can't explain it.
Story 3. The Guy at the Gas Station. I live in a small town in Ohio where everyone usually knows each other. This story happened a couple of years ago, and I still can't explain it. That day I was driving home late in the evening. I needed to refuel, so I stopped at a local gas station that is open 24/7. I walked inside, grabbed a bottle of water, and went to the counter. There was a guy standing there who looked familiar. You know that strange feeling when you're sure you've seen someone before, but can't remember where. He was wearing a baseball cap, a denim jacket, and dark sunglasses. He seemed fine, but there was something off about him. When he turned to leave, I suddenly realized why he seemed familiar. This guy was dressed exactly like me. Denim jacket, Yankees cap, the same Timberland boots, and even the same bottle of water in his hand. At first I thought, cool, just a coincidence. But then he walked past me, and for a moment I saw his face. It was me. Damn it, it was exactly me. I froze. I couldn't say anything. The guy just walked out of the store, got into a car that looked very similar to mine, and drove off. I followed him to get a better look, but the car had already disappeared. The entire drive home, I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a twin brother I didn't know about, but I don't have any brothers. Or maybe I was just exhausted and imagined it. But the scariest part came the next day. I decided to check the surveillance cameras at the gas station because I thought it might help. My friend works there, and he agreed to show me the footage. On the video, I could see myself entering the store, grabbing the water, and then standing by the counter completely alone. No guy, no car, nothing. This situation really scared me. I don't refuel at that station anymore and try not to think about what happened. But every time I remember this story, I get chills.
Story 4. The Delayed Reflection. I live in Seattle and often spend time at my favorite cafe on the ground floor of a building with huge mirrored windows. One morning, I was sitting by the window drinking coffee and watching the street. You know how you can see your reflection in the glass but also look through it at what's happening outside? Well, I turned my head to the side, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw that my reflection was still sitting and staring directly at me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head back, and my reflection, as if nothing had happened, repeated the movement with a 1 or 2 second delay. It felt like I was losing my mind. I even touched the table to make sure I wasn't asleep. Then I deliberately waved my hand, and the reflection did the same thing, but again with a delay. I quickly left the cafe because I couldn't sit there anymore. I haven't returned to that place, but I still try to understand whether it was some kind of optical illusion or something more.
Story 5. A call from the future. This happened in Austin, Texas. I was working from home, doing my usual task when my phone rang. The screen showed my best friend Nick's number. I picked up the phone and heard his voice. "Hey man, I know this sounds weird, but you won't believe what just happened." His voice sounded concerned, but not frightened, so I replied, "What's going on? Tell me." But just after that, the call dropped. I called him back, but he didn't answer. 5 minutes later, he called me again, but this time he said, "Hey, I just got a call from you. You told me not to go anywhere today. What's this joke?" I froze because I hadn't told him anything like that. We were both confused. We even checked the call history on our phones. My call to him was 5 minutes after his call to me. I still don't understand what happened. Although, to be honest, Nick really stayed home that day. And in the evening, we found out that a major accident had happened in the area where he was supposed to be.
Story 6. The apartment I never lived in. My name is Rachel, and this happened when I moved to New York. I rented a small apartment in Brooklyn through an online ad. The apartment was old, but the price was right for me. A few weeks later, I decided to meet my neighbors. The woman in the apartment across the hall, Mrs. Grayson, said, "Rachel, it's so nice to see you again. I thought you moved a few months ago." I was surprised. "Again? I just moved in." She looked confused and then said, "But you already lived here in the spring. You even had the same suitcase when you arrived." I assured her this was my first time in New York, but she looked like she didn't believe me. A few days later, I found a photo in my closet. It was a picture of me standing outside the apartment. The thing is, I never remembered this photo being taken.
Story 7. The Neighbor Who Was Always Home. I live in an apartment building in Chicago, and our walls are thin. Sometimes I hear my downstairs neighbor Joe watching TV or listening to music. He has a habit of playing old rock hits late at night. It's a little annoying, but I've gotten used to it. One time, I decided to go down to ask him to turn the music down because I had an early start the next day. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The music was still playing, and there was light visible from the apartment. The next day, I ran into our concierge and jokingly said that Joe probably didn't hear me because of his music. The concierge looked surprised. "Joe? He moved out 2 weeks ago. There's no one in the apartment." I thought he was confused and decided to check for myself. I went down to the apartment, knocked again. No one opened the door, but the music was still playing. The next evening, the same thing happened. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. To make sure, I asked a friend to come with me. We knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I called the concierge, and he came with spare keys. When the door opened, the apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no lights, no music. Just an empty apartment. I don't hear music from that apartment anymore, but I still don't understand what happened. If Joe moved out long ago, who was playing the music?
Story 8. The Repeating Road. My boyfriend Alex and I were driving late in the evening from Portland to Seattle. It's not a very long trip, but we were tired, so we decided to stop at a gas station. When we got back on the road, I noticed something strange. The road looked exactly the same as before the gas station. The same billboards, the same truck we had passed 10 minutes earlier. I thought it was a coincidence, but then I saw the gas station we had just left. Alex started to get nervous. We definitely passed this place already. What the heck? We decided to pull over and check the map. The phone showed we were in the right place, but still, 5 minutes later, we saw the same gas station again. At this point, we were scared. Alex suggested turning around and going back. When we made the U-turn, the road suddenly changed. New landmarks appeared on the horizon, and we never saw that strange gas station again. We made it to Seattle without any problems, but that part of the road feels like it was rewound. We've never taken that route again because we're afraid it will start repeating itself.
Story 9. The Woman in the Red Coat. This story happened in New York when I was rushing to work. It was an ordinary winter day, with many people on the streets. I was standing at a crosswalk, waiting for the green light. In the crowd, I noticed a woman in a bright red coat. She was standing slightly ahead of me, and her bright clothes stood out among the people in dark jackets. When the light turned green, I walked behind her. We crossed the street, and I turned onto my street. The woman in the red coat took the same road. I wasn't surprised, as this is the downtown area, but a few minutes later, I noticed her again. This time, she was walking toward me from the other side of the street. I was confused because it was impossible. We had just walked in the same direction. But what scared me the most was that I noticed something. The same grimace on her face as the one I saw a few minutes ago. I stopped to let her pass, and it seemed like she noticed my stare. She stopped a few meters away from me, looked directly into my eyes, and silently smiled. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. I felt a chill. It all seemed like she was playing with me. That day, I even left the office early because I felt like I was being followed. Story 10. The Father I Saw in the Park. My father passed away when I was 12. We were very close, and it took me a long time to accept his loss. It happened in Georgia, where I grew up. 15 years later, when I was 27, I was living in Atlanta and decided to go to the park one day to read a book. I was sitting on a bench reading when I suddenly felt someone's presence nearby. I looked up and saw a man walking along the path. He was wearing an old denim suit, which had been my father's favorite clothing. As he got closer, I saw his face and froze. It was my father. Without a doubt, it was him, just as I remembered him before he passed. He looked younger than he should have at that age, but it was him. I couldn't move. He walked past me, but he didn't seem to notice me. I stood up and ran after him, but when I turned the corner, he simply disappeared. I told my mom about it, and she said, "Maybe he just wanted you to know. He's still here."
Story 11. The Call That Didn't Happen. I work as a night security guard in an office building in Minneapolis. At night, it's quiet and empty, just me and the monitors showing all the floors. One night, I got a call on the phone in my booth. The number was an internal one from the 8th floor. I picked up the phone, although I knew no one should be there at 2 a.m. "Hello, who is this?" I asked. There was only silence in response. Then I heard a faint rustling sound, like someone was running their hand along the telephone wire. "Hey, if this is a prank, stop. There shouldn't be anyone in the building." The rustling stopped and the call ended. I decided to go check the 8th floor. I took the elevator, got off, and walked down the corridors. It was quiet, with only dim lighting. But when I approached the office from which the call had come, the door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered that all offices should be locked. I peeked inside, but no one was there. There was a phone on the desk, and next to it was an old photograph. In the photo, there was a man in a 1960s suit, staring directly at me. I picked up the photo but didn't notice anything unusual. The next day I showed it to a colleague who had worked there longer. He went pale. "This is Tom Bennett, a former employee. He died in 1972. This was his office." That evening I submitted my transfer request.
Story 12. The Dream That Saved My Life. A few years ago, I lived in Los Angeles and worked as a taxi driver. One evening, while I was napping on the couch, I had a very strange dream. In the dream, I was in my car, standing at an intersection. The traffic light turned green, and I moved forward. Suddenly, a truck appeared from the left and crashed into my side at full speed. The impact was so strong that I woke up, sweating and scared. I decided not to pay much attention to the dream, but the next day, when I was actually at that same intersection, the light turned green. I was about to go forward, but I remembered the dream. I paused for a second, and then the truck appeared from the left, running through the red light. If I had gone ahead, it would have crashed directly into my car, just like in my dream. This incident made me think about whether dreams can be warnings. Since then, I always pay attention to them.
Story 13. The Time Loop at the Hotel. I worked at a hotel in San Diego. It was an old hotel with beautiful decor, but a strange atmosphere. One night, I was working the night shift, and everything was calm until 3 a.m. when a man came to the front desk. He was wearing a dark coat, which seemed odd since it was warm for that time of year. He asked me about room 405, to which I responded that it was a regular room on the second floor. The man said he needed that specific room, although I clearly remembered it being occupied. I checked the system and confirmed the room was reserved, but the man didn't seem surprised. He simply thanked me and headed toward the elevator. I decided to check because he was being too insistent. When I got to the elevator, I was surprised again. The man was no longer there. The elevator was on the top floor. I returned to the front desk, and at that moment, the phone rang. It was a call from room 405. I answered, but no one spoke. I redialed after a minute, but the phone on the other end just stayed silent. I went up to room 405, and when I opened the door, I found the room completely empty. The system didn't confirm the room's booking until several hours after the man had asked about it. Since then, I'm afraid to work night shifts.
Story 14. The Time Error. It happened when I was working a night shift at an office in Chicago. I arrived at work as usual at night, and when I started checking my emails, I noticed that the time on the clock was around 3:15 a.m. I continued working, and when I looked at the clock again, it was already 3:45. But here's the strange part. Just a few minutes earlier, I had checked the time, and it was 3:15. I checked the records on my computer but didn't find anything suspicious. Then I went out into the hallway, and the clock on the wall showed 4 o'clock, although the time on my computer hadn't changed. Since then, I couldn't explain what happened. Maybe it was just a minor glitch, but the feeling of lost time still scares me.
Story 15. The Old Photo. This story happened a few years ago when I was spending time with my parents at their summer house. We found old boxes of things, and among them was a photo of me and my parents that I didn't remember at all. In the photo, we were all in the garden near an old tree, but I couldn't recall when it was taken. I showed the photo to my parents, and they couldn't remember the moment either. Everything in the photo looked familiar, but the moment it was taken felt completely foreign to me. It was so surprising that I asked my parents several times if they remembered this event, but they also couldn't say anything. Maybe it was just a forgotten moment from our lives, but I still can't explain why this photo felt so unfamiliar.
Story 16. The Lost Place That Reappeared. This happened 2 years ago when I went with friends to a town just 3 hours away from my home. We decided to take a walk in the old part of the town, where there are many interesting buildings and cafes. One time we came to a street that looked quite familiar, but I couldn't remember when I had been there before. After getting a little lost, we tried to find our way back to the main road. But here's what happened. We saw a small cafe that I definitely didn't remember, although by description and appearance, it seemed like we had already been there. It was a very small place that didn't seem to have anything special, but we all noticed that the board outside had our favorite dish written on it. We decided to go inside and have coffee. However, when we returned after a few hours on the same street, we couldn't find the cafe. It was so strange that we initially thought we were being pranked. We started looking around all the streets and areas, but the cafe simply didn't exist, not even any trace of us being there. We went back home, and later I discovered that the next day we ended up on the same street again. All the locals we asked couldn't confirm the existence of the cafe, even though I clearly remembered its interior and sign.
Story 17. The email that shouldn't have been on my computer. Last year, I was working remotely and often corresponded with various people through email. One evening, I received a strange letter about a personal problem of my friend. The content of the letter was very emotional and serious, so I started to worry and thought I should call. But here's what was strange. I was absolutely sure this was an old letter. I tried to remember why it looked so familiar, and even began searching my archive to see if I'd looked at it before. However, when I went through my emails, I couldn't find it. It got even stranger. I contacted my friend and found out that she hadn't sent me any letter at that time. We both checked our inboxes, but the email wasn't in either of them. What was striking was that I clearly remembered opening and reading that letter, but I couldn't find it on my computer or in my email history. Since then, I've started to doubt whether it was just a glitch or something more.
Story 18. Lost items that came back. This story happened to me when I was a student. One time, I went to visit my parents for the weekend and left some things on my desk that I planned to take back to university. It was a small package of documents and a few books. When I returned 2 days later, I couldn't find those things. I searched the entire apartment carefully, looked in every corner, but they were gone. A few days later, when I almost gave up the search, I came back from university and found the things right on my desk. I was absolutely sure they had disappeared, and I couldn't understand how they ended up back in their place. It was incredibly strange because I was totally convinced I hadn't left them there, and when I first searched for them, I couldn't find them. Now I just assume it was one of those moments when reality gets a little twisted.
Story 19. The Day That Didn't End. This story happened to me during my travels in Europe. One day, I woke up in a hotel room in Paris, ready to start a new day. I was planning to go on some tours and walk around the city, but something felt off. When I looked at the clock, I saw that time had stopped. It was 10:30 in the morning. I thought maybe I was just extremely tired, and my head couldn't process the time properly. But after a few minutes, I looked at the clock again, and it still showed 10:30. I even checked my phone, and it was the same. This seemed strange, so I decided to leave the room and go outside. When I stepped out of the hotel, I noticed that everyone around me was acting strangely. People were walking and standing, but their movements seemed slow, and everyone had a kind of stillness about them. I tried to talk to a few people, but they just mumbled incoherently and then stopped moving again. Eventually, I went back to my room and sat on the bed, trying to collect my thoughts. After a few hours, I looked at the clock again and saw that it had finally started moving. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and I couldn't understand what had happened during all that time. That day, I felt like I was in a closed cycle where time moved slower, and everything around me repeated. I still couldn't find a logical explanation for why that day dragged on so long.
Story 20. My old photograph I never took. This happened to me a few months ago, and I still can't explain how it happened. I was spending the weekend in a small town and decided to visit old places where I spent my childhood. I was feeling very emotional because I hadn't seen these places for a long time and wanted to relive some memories. While walking around the town, I entered a park where I always loved spending time. There, I noticed a bench I remembered well. My grandfather always sat on it when I was little. I sat on the same bench, reminiscing about the time we spent together. I started checking my phone, looking at messages and photos. And then things started to get strange. I saw a photo that was definitely taken in the same park, but I hadn't taken it. In the photo, I was sitting on the same bench where I was now sitting. It was such an old photo that at first I thought it was just childhood memories someone in the family had taken. But in the photo, I looked much older, and it seemed to have been taken not long ago. I looked at the photo again. There was a mixture of emotions on my face, and in my hands I was holding an old camera I had never used. All the details in the photo felt so real that I even felt uncomfortable because I didn't remember taking it. I even checked all my phone galleries to make sure it wasn't some mistake with the archive, but I couldn't find the photo in any of my folders. I shared this with a few friends, and they were just as amazed because they knew I hadn't been in that park that day to take such a photo. This moment made me feel like I had stepped into some parallel dimension where certain moments in time stop. I still haven't been able to understand how that photo appeared, and honestly, I'm not sure I even want to know the answer. Maybe this case will remain one of those mysteries that I won't be able to solve.
Story 21 inches. The phone call that never happened. A few months ago, I had an unusual experience while working late at night. I was finishing up some tasks when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar, though I couldn't place it right away. It was a friend from university whom I hadn't spoken to in a while. They told me they needed to talk about something important, but the call abruptly cut off before we could continue. I was confused, but when I checked my call history, there was no record of the call. I checked my phone's logs several times, and I couldn't find any trace of it, not even in missed calls. The weirdest part was that the voice on the other end sounded as if it was coming from someone I had known, but the number didn't match any of my contacts. I tried reaching out to my friend, but they said they hadn't called me that night. It still feels like a mystery, and I'm not sure if it was just my imagination or something else.
Story 22 inches. The unseen object. One evening, I was walking home from a friend's place, passing through a park I always take. As I was walking, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a small object hovering above the ground. It looked like a faint blur, almost like a reflection from a passing car's headlights, but there were no cars around at the time. I stopped and stared at it for a moment. It hovered for a few seconds before disappearing. I was sure I saw something, but I couldn't explain what it was. I asked a few people walking nearby if they saw anything strange, but none of them had noticed anything unusual. I haven't been able to figure out what that object was, and every time I walk through that park, I wonder if I'll see it again.
Story 23. The repeating song. One evening, I was at home relaxing when I started hearing a song playing in the background. It was a song I'd heard years ago, but I couldn't remember where. The melody was faint at first, like it was coming from a distance, but it grew louder over time. I looked around the apartment, trying to find the source of the music, but there was no radio, no speakers, and nothing that could play music. I even asked my neighbors if they were playing something, but they said they hadn't heard anything. The song continued for hours, repeating the same verse over and over. When I finally fell asleep, it stopped. The next day, the song was completely gone, and I couldn't remember the lyrics, but it felt like it was something important. It still puzzles me how it appeared out of nowhere, and I've never heard that song again.
Story 24 inches. The Vanishing Road. I was driving through the countryside one weekend, enjoying the quiet roads and the beautiful landscape. I decided to take a detour down a small road I hadn't driven before. The road was narrow, surrounded by tall trees, and there were no signs indicating where it led. I drove for what felt like hours, but when I finally decided to turn back, I couldn't find the road anymore. I circled the area, but no matter which direction I went, I couldn't locate the same road. It was as if it had disappeared entirely. I even asked a few locals, but they didn't know what I was talking about. I've tried to find that road again since, but it's as if it was never there. I don't know whether it was my imagination or something stranger at work, but I still can't explain what happened.